After the listing of Sycamore, you were richest Indian on the planet.
I think a good entrepreneur is irrationally optimistic. People who are pessimists don't make good entrepreneurs.
You mentioned that 72% of the internet traffic was going through your lines. What were some learnings from that fast growth?
My logic was, just like every phone is connected to every other phone in the world, every computer has to get connected to every computer in the world. And those days, people could only send 300 bits per second on a phone line. This company had figured out how to do 9600 bits per second. Using optics, we created this thing called intelligent optical networking. The very first quarter, we shipped $10 million. And then the next quarter was 20 million, and then 30 million, 60 million, 90 million, 120 million, 150 million.
Can you give us the framework? Because you have done that multiple times over and over.
With the connected world, things move very fast. Nanotechnology is huge and it's going to have a big impact. It's hard, particularly in India, grow up in a middle class. It's those difficulties that really give you a learning opportunity and broaden your comfort zone.
You married Jayashree ma'am. Jayashree ma'am and Sudha ma'am are sisters. The sisters have an ability to sense two future billionaires.
Thoda.
You have flown in the Air Force with Bill Clinton.
Immigration officer and everybody else, they come inside the thing and they salute him. Welcome, sir. It's a royal treatment.
Are you sure about something happening 50 years down the lane?
The smartest of the smart will have a fantastic time because they're always on top of the game. But the people who are left behind, they will have a harder time.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Shivank and we are part of the 01 Network by Zerodha. Together, we intend to bring you insights from the top thinkers in the field of entrepreneurship, technology and investing.
So tell me, what were you doing when you were 22-year-old?
When I was 22, I just graduated from IIT Madras and then went to Canada.
This was 1973 and you had $8 in your pocket.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a big deal because almost anybody who left in the 70s had only $8 in the pocket because the reserves in India were very, very low. And so the only amount of foreign exchange they gave you was $8.
A month or for entire year?
No. I mean, anybody who wanted to convert the rupees into dollars could get $8.
Only $8?
Beyond that, you had to get special permissions. Like, let's say, if a business guy wanted to go make a trip to UK or US or something like that, he probably had to work on it for about 6 months before he could get exchange to be able to pay for that trip and everything else. So because the reserves were very low, I mean, they didn't have enough dollars. And so they really had to restrict it. So when we left, we got $8, but...
What did you end up doing with those $8?
Well, I mean, it was enough to... the airfare was paid for. And so we didn't really need much money. So maybe I paid for the taxi from the airport to my dorm or something like that, a couple of dollars. So I still had some money left. But at that age and that opportunity, it never looked risky. You know, now when you tell the story that you left a country with just $8 in your pocket, it looks very risky, but it didn't feel that way. Everything just looked like an opportunity.
You went to America and then Canada, and then you were teaching there.
No. I went there to do my graduate school.
Okay.
Right? I'd done my bachelor's here. So I had full scholarship. So once I got there, they started paying me money and everything else. So I could live comfortably. But it took me 2 years to finish my master's. But when I finished my master's, the professor with whom I was working went to Australia on sabbatical because there's a sabbatical concept. But my idea was to go there for 2 years and just come back. So I was ready to pack up and come back to India. And then he said, hey, why do you want to go back this year? I'm going to Australia. So why don't you do my job for a year? And then you can go back and you'll have a lot of money in your pocket, right? And that sounded like a great deal. So I actually stayed back in Canada and decided to teach. So I became a professor. And I was probably 75, so 24, 25 years old. And I loved teaching. I got voted as one of the best professors. And so at that point, I was convinced that my future was to be a professor. And so, but still in India, coming back and doing it in India. But you cannot be a university professor without a PhD. So I decided to do a PhD and then come back. And that's how the next step happened. And so I finished my 1 year of service. So that was 3 years, 2 years for master's, 1 year for service. And then I came back here for 2-3 months vacation, went back and then did my PhD.
After that, what happened?
When I was finishing my PhD, I was doing it in Queen's University near Toronto. And Toronto had a company called ESC, which was a high-tech company, communications company, telecommunications company, which is the area in which I was doing my PhD. And those days, this is 1979-80 timeframe, people could only send 300 bits per second on a phone line, right? That was the most amount of communication that you got. This company had figured out how to do 9,600 bits per second. So which is like a big jump. And all of that was with signal processing, noise cancellation and all that kind of stuff. So it was very good technology. But the company wasn't doing well in terms of their marketing, finance and everything else. So the company was really going under. And so the VP of engineering, Dr. Peter Brackett, he had to quit the job at this startup and come and teach. So he was teaching at Queen's University. And so I got to know Peter really well for a year. And so we got to be good friends because I was a bachelor and his wife and kids stayed back in Toronto. So he was also like a bachelor. So we spent a lot of time together, really got to know each other. And so what happened was Motorola, which is a large company, came and bought this struggling company in Toronto. And when they bought that company, they asked Peter Brackett to come back and be the head of engineering again. And so Peter left university and he went back to this place and he was still working for the same struggling company, but now it was Motorola, right? So they had resources and everything else. So 3 months after he left, I finished my PhD. And so Peter called me up and said, hey, Desh, forget all this teaching, research, everything else. Why don't you come here? It's a lot of fun. And I went to Toronto to work for this company, mostly based on Peter, because Peter was such a great guy. And so I joined him. And then over the course of next 4 years, from 1980 to 84, it was a very successful ride. We went from 20 people to 400 people, $100 million, very profitable business and so on. And there were 3 of us who made it all happen, Peter, myself, and then the CEO, Ted Strain at that point. And so in 84, and then also I got married to Jayashree in 1980. And so in 84, when I and Jayashree looked back, we said, hey, if I can do this for Motorola, maybe we can do this for ourselves. That was my first inkling and taste of an entrepreneurship. And but there was no venture capital in Toronto, so you couldn't do it there. The only 2 places in the whole world were Silicon Valley and Boston. And so actually, I thought I would move to Silicon Valley. And Motorola had just bought a company in Silicon Valley called Fourface, a computer company. And the head there was somebody from communications. So he knew me. So I called him up and said, hey, I'm thinking of moving to California. And so he was very happy. So he said, why don't you come? And I went there and interviewed and looked at the homes, everything else. So he made me an offer. I was all set to go to California. But then our telecommunications headquarters for Motorola was in Boston. And so when they came to know that I was considering moving to California, they called up and said, Desh, no, you can't do that. We'll create some special position for you and everything else. And so they were very nice and very kind and created a very nice opportunity for me in Boston. So in 1984, we moved from Canada to Boston.
What happened in this 4 years, sir, 1980 to 84, which led to the growth? What exactly 3 of you did to boost the growth from 20 people to 400 people and to 100 million revenue company?
Well, Canada has pretty good engineers. So we were very good in engineering. But what we lacked was marketing and sales channels to get to the customers. And a lot of the big customers are in US. So once Motorola bought us, and then we had the the power of Motorola's distribution, then it was easy, between myself and Peter. We could interface, and I probably was in US pretty much every 2 weeks, meeting customers and so on. So we were able to translate what customers wanted in US to an appropriate technology. And then developing the technology was pretty easy in Canada. So we were able to, in some ways, this group in Canada was a lot more efficient, a lot more capable, very frugal compared to our counterparts in US. And so we were very good in identifying opportunities in the marketplace, converting those into technical specifications, converting the product, and just getting them out there. And so that became a big hit, which is the essential capability of any entrepreneur, right?
So can you deep dive, and with examples, can you help me break down this capability? If a 22-year-old who is watching this and he wants to understand the capability of what the market wants, specify that, making the product and then sell this. Can you break this capability that you spoke about right now?
Yeah. So when do you win? You win when there is a need in the marketplace, something that the customer wants, but he doesn't have it, right? And so what was happening was, the telephone lines that you got were very expensive. So if you got a line from, let's say, Toronto to Boston, you'd probably pay maybe $1 million a month. It's a lot of money, right? And so you could just put 2 modems on it and send maybe 300 bits per second. And slowly, it wasn't the phone connections anymore. It was really data. So if you can send more and more data on that very expensive line that you got, it's good for them. Right? Then you don't have to get 2 lines. They don't have to get 10 lines. And the slight difference in the way the telephones work versus data works, in telephone, it's a fixed line. If you have certain bandwidth, you have to use that bandwidth all the time for one phone call. Whereas in data, the information comes in bursts, right? So whenever you want to packets. So when you're sending some packets, they go that way and then there's nothing much happening there. And so you can multiplex, right? You can also multiplex phones, but you have to, let's say you take 8 phones and you can multiplex them on one line and then you can demultiplex them on the other side, but you can only get 8, no more, right? Whereas in data, if you can collect data packets and then you can statistically multiplex those, you get a lot more than 8.
Okay.
And so building statistical multiplexers was a huge value because instead of getting 4 lines, like spending $4 million a month, they could just spend $1 million a month. So the value of this technology was $3 million a month, right? So when you identify an opportunity like that, where a customer gets a huge advantage and it's a technology that's implementable, then you win. So, and then what happens is you add more complexity to it. For example, so you have point A, you have point B, and you're trying to take one line and statistically multiplex these packets, and you get the same capability as getting 4 of these lines. And then you say, well, we don't have to stop there. Usually, if there's a company has Toronto, Boston, Chicago, Phoenix, Arizona, like multiple sites, 5 places. And then usually computers want to go from everywhere to everywhere else. So instead of trying to get point-to-point lines between all these pairs, what you do is you build a network. So you'll have one connection from Boston to Toronto to Boston, another one from Boston to Chicago, Chicago to Toronto, let's say, a triangle. If you have a triangle, then information can go from anywhere to anywhere. For whatever reason, if one line gets cut, you can automatically reroute your traffic and everything else. So slowly you can see how we can start adding complexity there to bring more value for the customer. And adding that complexity, and then you have to say, well, you have to manage all this thing, so you need network management. And so building a lot of these capabilities is what lets you retain the customer. Because if there's a huge value that people can bring in and it's simple, you can do it. You'll get it for a month or two, but then there'll be 10 other people who'll come in.
Right.
And so you don't have a competitive advantage. So if you want to keep up your competitive advantage, you have to keep adding more value so that the customer derives more value from the capabilities that you're bringing to the marketplace.
How did you figure out this technology at the first place, sir?
It's pretty simple, statistical multiplexing, but making it happen was a challenge those days. Now it's like a piece of cake, but those days, you did not have computers. You had microprocessors, and those microprocessors had very little capability. So to be able to receive a packet, put it in the memory, and then get the appropriate packet out in the front, get it out on the other side, and then have a protocol to decipher it on the other side, all this stuff was complex. But what happens is the core technology like microprocessors, memory, all this stuff, the Moore's law, you double every 18 months and half the cost, and it still keeps going. So anything that was not so possible 2-3 years ago becomes possible now. And so if you really understand the customer's problem, solutions that were not possible 3 years ago are possible now. And that's the opportunity for entrepreneurs, right? You jump in, you bring the solution, and then you please the customer. And then, of course, you have to work hard to retain the market share and the customer mind share.
So you rode on the telecom wave, sir, right?
Yeah.
Let's say if you were 22 again in 2025, what wave will you ride on?
So let me tell you the wave that I was on and how that changed over the course of time. So we talked about 300 bits going to 3600 bits, 9600 bits. And then Cascade was a little bit of a shift. What was the shift? The shift was the insight there was at that time, people would connect computers, but would connect computers only within a company. So a Ford Motor Company would have all their branches interconnected. Slowly, they started saying, this is not good enough. I need to connect this with my supply chain, some other company that supplies these parts to me, because I need to know when those parts are going to be coming to me and so on. So people slowly started connecting groups of companies. And what I did was I went back and looked at the history of telephones. Telephones were the same ways in 1920s and 30s. When the telephone technology came along, companies used to build their own phone network and connect them with the branches so that employees could talk to each other within a company. But by 1980, when I was starting my first company, there was no phone in the world in 1980 where a phone was not connected to every other phone in the world, right? So my sort of logic was, just like every phone is connected to every other phone in the world, every computer has to get connected to every computer in the world. But to make that happen, you have to have a computer network, not a phone network, right? And what companies were doing, the big companies like Lucent, Nortel, all these guys, which are all multi-billion-dollar companies, they were all multi-billion-dollar companies based on telephone switches.
Okay.
So that they would sell this $10 million huge telephone exchange, and they would just put a little bit of a data module on it to send data. But they were not designed for data. Whereas if you take a telephone switch that's almost like this whole room, and then you take 1/10 of it, that's more than enough to build a computer network, which is like 1,000 times more capable, right?
Right.
And so I said, so two things had to happen to get this vision going. One is you have to build switches that are good in packet switching, just computer switching. And secondly, these switches have to be owned by a public network, not by a private network. Because at that time, all the data, these statistical multiplexers and everything else we built, they were always bought by individual companies, and the companies built their own network. That is okay if you want to connect every computer in a company to every other computer in the company, but not every computer to every other computer in the world. And so building these packet switching networks for public networks was the opportunity. And so in 1980, when I started working on this, some people would agree, some people would not agree, and it was like a slightly forward-looking idea.
Mhm.
But fortunately, within like 2-3 years, internet came along, and that's exactly what internet is.
The public infrastructure.
And
Yeah.
that's why in 1990 is when Cascade started. So within 94, within 4 years, we went public. 97, when we sold the company,
For $3.7 billion.
yeah, we used to carry 80% of the internet traffic on the backbone.
Within 4 years.
The 7 years.
Within 7 years.
So we were the primary internet backbone carriers at that time. So we went from 9600 bits to maybe megabits, but more sophisticated packet switching. And then, so what happened in 1990 when I started Sycamore, so that was like the next stage of this evolution. So we were connecting every computer to every other computer in the world, but we were connecting because we were connecting them with megabit pipes. And the megabit pipes were still very expensive.
Mhm.
And they were very hard to get. So if you wanted a connection, a megabit from Boston to New York, the telephone company would take maybe 6 months to commission it and give it to you, and it would be very expensive. Because it was very expensive, a lot of the companies like Cisco, Cascade, all the other communication companies, we used to work on this thing called quality of service. And probably collectively we spent more than like $1 billion a year. And the whole idea was to prioritize these packets so that video packets gets the highest priority, and then next audio packets, and then the file transfer packets. So that even if you had limited bandwidth, you could still communicate all these
Right.
things. And so that quality of service is a pretty complex thing because you have to constantly look at packet and say, is this more important? If it is, then I have to get it ahead of the queue and all that kind of stuff. But then in 1990, when I got exposed to a few engineers from MIT, I got to learn about fiber optics. In fiber optics, a fiber optic is like as thin as a hair, right? And on that thin thing, you can blink laser beam on one side at 10 billion times a second, and you can interpret it on the other side. So on a single fiber, you can get 10 billion times bits per second. And not only just one fiber, because these lasers, you can send them at different frequencies. So not just one laser, but you can put 200 laser beams on one of these thin fibers, right? So you can get enormous amount of bandwidth on this fiber. So my thing was, hey, what's the point in spending so much money on doing quality of service and everything else, where you have an opportunity to create abundance of bandwidth?
Using optical
fiber.
Optical fiber.
So using optics, we created this thing called intelligent optical networking.
Okay.
So we combined the laser beams, optics and everything else, but also we combined all the technology that we had developed for internetworking and so on. So you take fiber, let's say from Boston to New York, New York to Chicago, Chicago to Boston, and then these are all laser beams that are going back and forth. But you would have it so that if ever a fiber gets cut, it gets automatically rerouted and everything else. So and we called it intelligent optical networking because it provided two capabilities. One was, it was very cheap. I mean, it was like you had so much bandwidth, you didn't have to do quality of service anymore. And secondly, provisioning time. You know, if a telephone company had to give a bandwidth to somebody, they could do it instantly. It was not like a 6 months because you didn't have to go and make physical connections and everything else. So those two things, and those are technology capabilities. But usually the time when you get an opportunity to build these large companies is something changes in the marketplace also, the demand, right? So for Cascade, it was the internet that drove the demand. For Sycamore, it was the breakup of AT&T. in US, AT&T had a monopoly. So they owned the entire network, right? And what they did in US is that they broke up that monopoly and said there is a backbone carrier and a regional carrier. They were called Bell operating companies. And then they also said they can be alternate carriers. So anybody can go get right away. You put your fibers, you build your network, and you can sell the services. You can sell phone service and computer services. So a lot of these new companies popped up. So people would go get right away, put fiber, get stuff and get some customers. And customers were very happy because, AT&T was a monopoly, and so it would take forever to get a line and so on. And then all these alternate carriers started getting enormous amount of valuation in the Wall Street. So they would say $500 for a retail customer, $5,000 for a small customers, $500,000 for an enterprise customer, all that kind of stuff. So the Wall Street would just add up all these numbers and say, you're worth $10 billion. And then the carriers would say, oh, okay, 10 billion. So I'll go to the market, raise another 2 billion and use that $2 billion to build even bigger networks and get even more customers. So they didn't have to make money, but they had enormous amount of cash to spend. So Sycamore had an enormous demand. So we started shipping the product in the 5th quarter, which was very, very fast for a very complex hardware software product. But the very first quarter, we shipped $10 million. And then the next quarter was 20 million, and then 30 million, 60 million, 90 million, 120 million, 150 million. These were quarterly revenue growths. And so, and then we went public within the 5th quarter and all that kind of stuff.
And on public listing, your dollar went from $38 to $274.
Yeah.
7x on listing.
Yeah.
Which was like $14 billion at that time.
Yeah. And then it went up to 50 or something.
Right.
So there was a huge amount of demand. But then 2 things happened. One was the Wall Street woke up and said, well, I mean, we can't give these guys money all the time. They have to make money. So the Wall Street took a hit, and then the markets came down for them. So they started running out of cash a little bit. And then also, meanwhile, because we had such a huge market cap, all the other companies, like the big companies like Siemens and Alcatel and Lucent, I mean, they had been in business for 100, 200 years, and their market caps were lower than ours. So they were saying, what's wrong? And so they started investing heavily into this optical networking. And then every venture capitalist said, we need a Sycamore knockoff. So they all invested in Sycamores. So there was the demand came down, and then the supply went up because everybody was investing so much in technology. And so everybody could very easily do 100, 200 laser beams on a fiber, but the market maybe could use 5 or 6. So usually until that time in telecommunications, the demand was always a lot more than what technology could keep up. So the demand was like that, technology was like that. So when the technology catches up with the demand, you get a huge premium because you get 80% margin, right? But for the first time, technology overshot the demand. When that happens, it becomes a commodity. And the margins fall down. They come down to 30, 40%. In US, you can build companies if you have anywhere to the north of maybe 60% margin.
Okay.
Because of R&D and everything else. But I knew the whole telecom industry would drop down to 40%. In which case, the only way you can build a profitable company is either in India or China. And China had started Huawei at that time. And so I thought India needs a company. So I started Tejas. That's how Tejas got started. Huawei, of course, grew into a very large company because
$100 billion of subsidy over the years to a single company.
Yeah.
That was crazy.
Yeah. So the company, the government supported everything else. They just took a longer time, but we built a very strong company. Initially when we started, we had about 400 engineers. About 250 of them actually came from Bell Labs and MITs and all from US. They moved to India and built a company. So they built a world-class company, and we used to sell in we still sell in about 64 countries, and but we never got very large until recently. And Prime Minister Modi's Atmanirbhar is what created the opportunities. And also it suddenly started getting so big that we needed a bigger partner. So very fortunate that Tata came in. Chandra from Tata said, hey, we'll partner with you. So they own 55% of the company. And I'm very proud that last quarter, they shipped 3,000 crores worth of product. So that's a good story. But this comes back to the original question you asked, what if you're 22 years old?
In 2025.
Yeah. So initially when I was 22, if you could somehow send more bits, you had a business, because moving bits was a high margin company. When moving bits became commodity, then what you do with the bits became more important. That's when all the Google, Facebook, all that stuff started happening. So that's where the margin was. Now slowly, that game is over. So now you have enormous amount of data, and it's all moving all over the place. So what do you do with all that data is where the action is. And that's why you're seeing all these AIs and all that stuff. And somehow AI is going to touch every aspect of life. Doesn't matter whether it's education, medicine, supply chain, manufacturing, anything. So using those kind of technologies to restructure the businesses so that they're more productive, more profitable, more friendly, is where the action is.
AI the only technology in 2025 which you would touch?
No, I mean, you see, what happened is the innovation used to move at a certain pace, pretty low pace, because what happened in Chennai, nobody would know what happened. Same thing in Mumbai or Boston or New York or Los Angeles, right? Because all the innovation was happening in isolation. But with the connected world, things move very fast.
Right.
And so now, if I were to look at the innovation that's going on at MIT, nanotechnology is crazy. I mean, you can almost look at things at the atomic level, and you can almost arrange these things at atomic level, right? So nanotechnology is huge, and it's going to have a big impact. Material science, you can create materials. You can create these carbon nanotubes, which are like thin little things, and they're a lot stronger than a big steel beam, right? So materials is amazing. Energy, right? And so using the material science, creating energy, whether storage or generation or whatever, is amazing. Fusion, fusion has never happened so far, but MIT has just shown that you can actually have fusion. And so far, the world has not been able to prove that fusion happens, that they know. But it requires enormous energy to create fusion. So far, it isn't clear whether you can create fusion so that the amount of energy you put in is less than the amount of energy that it creates. So that proof should be happening within, I think it's in a small way it has happened, but the prototypes are getting built now. So within a couple of years, that'll get proven. It'll probably be in 2035 before you'll start seeing commercial versions of it. But it's pretty mind-boggling that those things are happening. So life sciences is another one. So far, life sciences has meant, doctors, they're not engineers, right? I mean, they mostly work on pattern recognition. You get fever and you give something, and if it works most of the times, then they say, well, that works. So next time you do this, you can take this.
Right.
Whereas now life sciences is pretty much being built from bottom up, almost like engineering. You start with cells and proteins and DNA and all that stuff, genome, and you construct the whole thing. So when something goes wrong, you can actually build the model and then go from there. For example, when COVID happened, the genome for the virus was available on 23rd of January of 2020 when it happened. By 30th of January, within a week, Moderna actually had a vaccination for that. And then it took 9 months or so to actually go through the clinical trials and proof and everything else. So that would never have happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So the life sciences will go through enormous. Now there's CRISPR. It's almost like you can take a stuff and, you can slice here, you can put something new in there and all that kind of stuff. And so like almost everything you look at, it's going in an enormous pace. So there are, if you live at MIT, and I've been on the board of MIT for the last 25 years, it's just mind-boggling. Every time, you go there, you like usually at the board meetings, they always get the latest guy who got the Nobel Prize to come and present. And the ideas are just mind-boggling. And it's just like it's all coming at you all at the same time. And so it's a pretty exciting time to be living in.
You're able to make this impact because you were able to create wealth creation machines. Whether it was, the Coral, which was sold for 15 million, then it was Cascade, which was merged for 3.7 billion, then Sycamore touched 50 billion. Let's say to do whatever, all the things that you do, any young person first need to, create that wealth. And then, of course, you can give in terms of your time, you can give in terms of your energy. But if you want to, give in terms of wealth, support causes, you need to understand that wealth creation and do that. Again, so let's say you're 22 again. You are observing these technologies which are happening. Can you give us the framework? Because you have done that multiple times over and over.
So, I don't know if it's wealth creation as the bottom line. It's more, the world works in a certain way, right? Let's say it's A. And you clearly see why the world does not need to be A. It can be B. And B is better than A. And so you're so passionate about taking the world from A to B that you want to make it happen. And taking it from A to B is what that entrepreneurship is all about. And you're driven by the fact that you clearly see that B is so much better than A. But it's not like you really know how to get there. Sometimes it could be a for-profit company. Sometimes it could be a non-profit. It doesn't matter. But if you have because it's the same thing. I mean, all these things, they need resources, they need people, they need team, all that kind of stuff. And when you get started, you don't have money, right? I mean, it's not like, $8, right? So I didn't have money. And so you still have to raise somebody else's capital, somebody else's, so you have to get other people to buy into what you believe in. So it's not that different whether you do a for-profit, non-profit, or any of these things. You have to have a clarity in terms of what is it that you're trying to do from A to B. And what happens is getting from A to B is hard, mostly because it's not clear how you get there. If it was clear,
everybody would have done it.
And it's not an entrepreneurial opportunity, right? It happens, and they don't need you. Because it's not very clear, you have to zigzag and get there and break it all down into small steps. So it's always, and B better be a lot better than A. If it's incrementally better, it's not worth doing it. So you need big vision, but you need small steps. So most of the people have a hard time doing that. You get professors who are very good in
their research.
Well, in painting a world, which is a very good word. But actually, they make it so hard, so complicated and so big that the first step that you have to climb is so high that you never climb it.
True.
Right? And then you get these tinkerers, the guys who actually like making things happen. And so they do climb little steps, but those little steps don't lead to anything big. So you have to somehow develop this combination of those two capabilities. You have to have a vision of where you want to get to, that's something a lot better than what we have now, but you have to be able to break it down into small steps, which are deliverable steps that you actually keep climbing one on top of another one. And what is that next step is where the gamble is.
I completely get it. Thanks for, breaking that into such a simple thing. But how do you learn that? How do you learn that ability, have that clarity of having a vision which is 10x better, and then actually breaking that down, and then you figure out. So what are for this recipe to work, what are some ingredients and how do you learn to put all those ingredients?
It turns out to be pretty simple in some ways, because it doesn't matter whether you do a for-profit or non-profit, cash is king. You need money, you need resources, right? So if you need resources and you don't have all of it day one, you have to say, it's like a driving on a desert. You're going this, let's say 1,000 miles in a desert, and you start with some gas in your tank, some petrol in your tank. Now, you better make sure that you have enough petrol on the tank to make sure that you meet the next petrol station, right? And so defining that next petrol station is your step.
Right.
And it better be small enough that whatever petrol you have is enough to get you there, right? If you don't get it right, and if you get distracted, if you start doing hundreds of things and just burn up all your petrol, and you don't get to that petrol station, the game is over.
You won't survive to leap to the destination.
Yeah. You'll either go bankrupt if it's a for-profit company. If it's a non-profit, you'll just struggle with it and you'll never come out of it. So it's a survival game.
Mm-hmm.
And the more sharply focused you are on making sure that you get your next amount of cash to be able to survive is what is a game.
So there are a lot of learnings between the stories. Let me put all the learnings one by one. And before that, I want to touch this other tangent. You mentioned that you married ma'am, Jayashree ma'am, in 1980. Jayashree ma'am and Sudha ma'am are sisters. And it's very fascinating for me to see that both of the sisters have an ability to predict, to sense two future billionaires. Can you tell me more about that ability of those methods of Jayashree ma'am and Sudha ma'am?
Or maybe it's got nothing to do with us. Anybody who married them would have become a billionaire. So
This is very interesting. How did you end up meeting Jayashree ma'am?
Well, I went to IIT Madras, and I was there from 1960 to 73. I left in 73. Jayashree went to IIT Madras in 73, and she did her master's in physics, 73 to 75. So I didn't really overlap with her in IIT Madras, but she's also from Hubli.
Okay.
And her mother and my mother were some of the rare people who went to college when they were young, and they used to teach at a same school. So they were friends. 1980, when I came back, and my mom was saying, hey, time to get married, you're getting to be close to 30 and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, there were not too many other girls who had gone to IIT and everything else from Hubli. So they said, hey, why don't you talk to Jayashree? And so we talked to Jayashree, and by that time, Jayashree had, she graduated in 75, and then she worked in NAL and ISRO in Bangalore. And that's what she was doing for the last 5 years. And so when we met, then we decided to get married, and that's how it all happened.
Do you remember? Can you recall the first interaction with her?
Yeah, I first met her in Hubli, and then I went to Bangalore, and then, we spent a few hours together.
And then you decided that you will get married.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So, a couple of things. The Coral Networks, which was acquired by Lenset.
No, Synoptics. Long time ago, yeah.
And you left before it got acquired. And I was just reading that there was a dispute in that. Can you share some learnings from what happened? And if same thing happens to a young entrepreneur, how should the entrepreneur should navigate?
So, I think there are a couple of lessons in Coral. Number one, those days, the venture capitalists used to have very little money, maybe 5 mil, 10 mil. So before they gave you $1 million, they wanted to make sure that you were committed.
Okay.
And if things don't work, you hurt more than they hurt. And so you had to go without a salary at least for a year, sort of thing. It wasn't like these days where you get a lot of money right away, all that kind of stuff. So actually, we moved to Boston in 84. 87 is when I got the green card. When I got the green card, I left. And Jayashree used to work. She did computer science, and then she used to work in Boston. We had 2 little kids. So she was the breadwinner, and I was like the guy trying to get this company going. And then a year later, dream come true. We actually got funded. We got $3 million, which was like a lot of money. 7 Rose and T Associates, like all very good companies. So when I got funded, Jayashree quit her job because the kids were very young. And then we started working on the product. I was more the junior guy. The other guy, Frank Bruns, he was in America for a long time, and he was established and so on. And so the difference of opinion we had was that we were trying to do something that was 10 times better than the competition in terms of all of this is still packet processing and everything else. But then this chip that we're trying to design, when we actually started designing after we got the money, it turned out that 10 times was hard, very hard. 5 times was a piece of cake. 6, 7 times was maybe doable. So I'm a big time to market guy.
Okay.
If you have something that's like 2, 3, 4 times better than what other people have, even if it's half baked, you need to get it up to the market, and get the feedback, understand better what people want, and then you start refining it, as opposed to trying to shoot for a very perfect product. But Frank, being a more senior guy than me, he had a different approach. He was a little bit more of a technical macho, and he said, no, we cannot,
Perfectionist.
we cannot give up. We have to make it 10 times better. And this conversation went on, for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. And then I started getting and then I had 2 choices, either leave or I stay back. But I didn't want to be the person staying back there because I knew this would not work well. Who knows? I mean, I may be right, he may be right. But I didn't want to be the person who constantly is there saying, I told you so, which makes it even worse for him, right? Even if it's 1% successone it'll make it 0 because there's somebody sitting there constantly saying it won't work. And so one day I was driving up to the company and stopped at the gas station, called up Jayashree and said, I think I'm going to quit today. And she said, well, if that's what you want to do, you should do it. And so I did. And it was very hard because when I quit, of course, Frank was very happy. The board, for them, Frank was more senior guy. I was more the junior guy. So it wasn't like they called me up and said, no, Desh, we want you and not Frank or anything like that. So, but then Jayashree didn't have a job. I didn't have a job. We were in this foreign country. It wasn't like you can call up your father and say, hey, send me some money. You could convert dollars anyway, even if you wanted to. And so it went on for 6 months and that was pretty hard. But then I got seed funded to do Cascade. So a couple of stories. One is, when I left Motorola to start Coral, I had a pretty good salary, I had a good position, everything else. But then, of course, when I went without a payroll, then we used to, but we had saved money by staying in a little house, old beat-up Toyota Corolla car, all that kind of stuff. So all my other friends who used to work for McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, all that kind of stuff, they would always come and they would feel really bad for me. They would say, hey, how can we help? You looks like you're going through a difficult time. But I never felt that way. And Jayashree never felt that way. It was like for us, hey, we get to do what we want to do. And so this is what we want to do. This is a lot of fun. So I think people should become entrepreneurs or pick anything in life because they want to do. And then it doesn't look like a sacrifice. Living a life of sacrifice is always not right. Some people live that way. They say, I'm going to work very hard so that I get a great job. And then I'm going to do a great job so they can get married and then have kids and then kids will do well. And, like you're always working towards something.
And that never happens.
And the day never comes.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what, all the Indian philosophy is, right? It's the journey and not the end. And so I think along the journey, if you keep doing things that you really want to do, you'll always be happy. And you're very thankful and you're very grateful for the opportunity to do things that you actually want to do. Now when I tell this story, it sounds like, wow, how did you go through that? It is so dangerous and all that kind of stuff. But never felt that way when we're going through that. So that's one lesson. Second lesson is that, in life, whenever things are not going right, you got to have some clarity in terms of either you have control over things or you don't have control over things. Sometimes things go bad from things that you have absolutely no control over. And sometimes things happen where you do control. If you control, you can always come up with a plan. You can work a little bit harder. You can fix the problems, everything else, and you should. But sometimes it turns out that things are happening because they're not in your control. In which case, you're better off cutting your losses and moving on,
Right.
as opposed to just struggling with it, And I think what stops people from being able to do that is just the fear. It's just like the analogy would be like a trapeze. You're on a trapeze, you're bored, or you don't like being on this trapeze. You want to catch on another trapeze, but when you take a swing, it's very hard to let go both your hands and catch the other trapeze because there's a risk that you may fall down, right? And turns out in life, it's okay, nothing fatal will happen. Things, you could get hurt a little bit, but having that confidence is very important. And what helped me and Jayshree is that we always felt that we had such good education, we're pretty capable. We always felt that, worst case, we will never go without a meal a day and a roof over our head. So what else is there? And I came with $8 in my pocket. So as long as
You've seen the worst.
as long as there's more than $8 in my pocket, I'm ahead of the game, right? So I think a lot of times, people getting over that fear is very important. And what happens is, it's hard, particularly in India, when people grow up in a middle class, that's how I grew up. And you live a life that's very disciplined. It's the same thing every day. It's very safe. You don't do anything bad, all that kind of stuff, which is a good thing. But also it limits your comfort zone because you don't take any risks, right? And so I think moving away from very comfortable environments into something that's a little bit different, interacting with people that are very different than you, going to a place where people don't speak your language, all those things, going to these situations where you have a very difficult time. Each one of those things, they broaden your comfort zone. That's why you'll see that most of the people, businesses and so on, when they build, usually you always see a failure and then people come back. Those who come back, they do something a little bit bigger. Because when they go through that experience, their comfort zone is a little bit broader. So they're able to take bigger risks, right? Because they're not afraid as much. And so when difficulties come in life, a lot of times people feel like they should just go to God and say, hey, please remove all these difficulties for me, kind of thing. Actually, it's the other way around. It's those difficulties that really give you a learning opportunity and broaden your comfort zone. So it's almost like you want to go looking for problems, as opposed to avoiding the problems. But if you get into problems because you're doing something that you believe in, I think you'll get natural energy to be able to face them.
You never felt that you were sacrificing because you were doing what you were enjoying. Luckily for me, I'm also figuring out certain things and I feel that I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. But for a lot of young folks, how do you get to that thing to which you can, for other people, it may look like a sacrifice, but for you, it won't ever. And you can just pick it up and go for 50 years. How do you come to that thing?
I think you have to do a little bit of self-reflection.
Okay.
When I was in IIT Madras, It's a very competitive environment. Kids come from all over the place, everything else. But every Sunday, somehow I got into this habit of going for a walk all by myself for about an hour.
Mhm.
And just sort of thinking about what happened that week, how did I behave, and so on. And those things really helped me. And I sort of got out of the rat race in some ways. Otherwise you're constantly trying to keep up with the Joneses, and the social media doesn't help you.
Mhm.
Because constantly, you want to be richer than somebody, you want to be prettier than somebody, you want to be better than whatever. You're constantly in that. You never realize what is important for you. You only realize what's important for other people that other people are telling you. And you need to get out of that. So I think taking some quiet time and reflecting on what's really important for you, and you have to observe a little bit too in terms of what is it that you really enjoy, right? And if you understand that, then it becomes easy. I think it should not be forced on you. Every time you're trying to do something because somebody else told you to do it, you'll never get that energy.
Which comes to that point which you were telling in one of your lectures, when a teacher gives you a problem to solve, it's an homework. But when you pick a problem to solve, it's something very different.
I think in that example, I was talking about, let's say, if they teach you something, a Pythagoras theorem, and give you problems to solve, constantly your mind says, how do I use Pythagoras theorem to solve this problem, right? But when you fall in love with some other problem, or you get into some difficult situations that you need to get out, your thinking is not constrained. You're not saying, how do I use only this to solve the problem?
You can find multiple ways.
Anything, you don't care. You just want to find a solution. So I think you get to think a little bit broader when you find things that you really want to do, and you start doing them.
Let's come to the learning from Cascade Communications, sir. And I was reading this, and you mentioned that within 4 years, 72% of the internet traffic was going through your lines. And the eventual goal was $3.7 billion merger. What were some learnings from that fast growth? What are some stories behind that merger, which we really, really need to learn?
So, I think it's all these things, in life, it's always a balance between this and that. So the company got started, and I slowly hired about maybe a dozen people, engineering people, who were building the product. And usually when you start a company and start doing something, you tend to work like 18, 20 hours a day. You just sleep in the company, all that kind of stuff, right? I mean,
Right.
Which is common to everybody. So but in a company, it's not just enough to work hard and do all things the right way and get it done. The most important thing in life is to make sure that you're doing the right thing. Doing the right thing is what comes from outside, right? How do you know that if you actually did all this, that somebody will actually buy it, the customer input? And so one of the things I used to do is to invite like a consultant kind of a guy once in a month to come and listen to what we're doing, and then comment on it or tell us and whatever he could add. So that's the external input.
Okay.
And first few times it would be very hard because, you're working so hard and you want to do something and you say, this is what we're doing. And the people from outside would come and they would say, well, but I don't know if it's going to work, blah, blah, blah. They're going to tell you that something is not right. And when you're so focused on something and somebody comes and says it's not right, it's very upsetting for the whole team.
Right.
But slowly the team got good at it because, obviously we have a lot deeper insight than most of these guys who come outside. They got very good in terms of being very passionate about what they do and being very confident and certain about what they do, but also being able to take inputs from other people. So, if one guy comes and says something, you can ignore it. But if you hear the same thing from like 5 people, there is a signal there. And so ability to step back and receive that signal and course correct if you need to and all that kind of stuff. So it's how do you become objective but also have this conviction, because no entrepreneur ever starts anything without conviction. And nobody ever succeeds without perseverance. So you need conviction, you need perseverance. But they can also work against you. What just because you have a conviction doesn't mean it's the right conviction, right? So you could be banging your head against the wall for a long time before you find that it's not the right thing to do. So you also have to throw in some objectivity into the equation. So how do you bring in that objectivity and not lose the conviction and the perseverance is something that whoever is starting the company as a leader has to make sure that he embraces.
And so after the listing of Sycamore, right, you were the richest Indian on the planet. Can you take me through that feeling? What were some learnings at that time when people were calling you the richest Indian on the planet?
It didn't mean anything to me. That was not my goal. If people call that, I said, okay, no big deal. Wasn't that important for me.
But did it allow you to do certain things that you were not able to do before?
Well, I think later on, because we had resources, we were able to do a lot more with the foundation, right? But that came a lot later. Meaning not that much later, 94 is when the first company went public. So we set up the foundation in 95. So 95 to probably 2001, 2002, the foundation was mostly, I think most of our support went to IIT Madras because we both came from IIT Madras and it was easy just writing checks and working with them. In 2001, 2002 is when we started focusing more on the foundation. And at that time, I used to do one for-profit and one non-profit every year. I did about 10 companies. And then over the last 15 years or so, we pretty much spend 95% of our time on the foundation. So now we became mostly in the foundation. So maybe I can tell you what the framework for the foundation is because it's something a lot of the people should think about. So there is 8 billion people in the world, right?
Right.
And out of which about 3 billion people have disposable income and 5 billion people don't have disposable income. And they all have problems. Solving the problem is about everything. Entrepreneurship, building companies, building nonprofits, governments, universities, everything. But the way you solve the problems of the people with disposable income is different than the way you solve the problems of the people who don't have disposable income. For the people who have disposable income, if they have a problem, you have to compete for that opportunity because they can buy, right? And so innovation becomes very important. So innovation plus relevance is equal to impact. So not only great idea, but the great idea has to be impacting them in some way. So it has to be relevant to them. And then it creates an impact. And that's what creates startups and everything else. And so that was the first part of our philanthropic journey for a while. I joined the MIT board in 2000. We put in $20 million to start the Deshpande Center at MIT. Most of the researchers at MIT used to research the whole thing and then patent the technology, go looking for opportunities, and not too many of them had impact. So we came up with this idea that the researcher needs to connect to the marketplace and the problem as he's innovating. So relevance becomes a part of the innovation process. And so when that happened, within 3-4 years, the anything that went through the Deshpande Center was 3 times more likely to have an impact than otherwise. And then later on, President Obama asked me to co-chair a council for innovation entrepreneurship. And so I got to work with the National Science Foundation to roll out this whole program throughout the whole country. It's called ICORP program. And we funded it for a year, but the very next year it became like a government program and so on. So it's a big program in US. 2,500 companies have come out of it.
Crazy. With insane level of impact. Yeah.
Same level of impact. And then about 7 years ago, we felt that ICORP program needs to be replicated in India. So we started Gopal Krishna Deshpande Center at IIT Madras. And even though it's based in IIT Madras, it's a nationwide program all across India. And it's going well. It's having the same impact. And for the first time this year, DST, Department of Science and Technology, has embraced the program, and we're working together. So I'm hoping we'll fund it for another 4 or 5 years, and then it'll become a part of the government program, just like in US, right? But all of that more or less benefits people who have disposable income.
Right.
But then for the last 15 years or so, we've been very focused on working on the bottom. So what's different about the bottom is that particularly if you come all the way down, those people are just struggling to get through the day. So it's not like they're looking for huge innovation and everything else. So relevance becomes very important. So you have to come up with interventions that are most relevant to them. And then you have to build capacity within those communities to be able to absorb it. And then if you're lucky enough to find an intervention that makes sense, it'll give you an opportunity to then put in technology, strategic planning, all the things that you use in the 3 billion people economy. But you should not start with innovation. And that's the mistake that most of the very smart people make when they work with the bottom of the pyramid. Most of the people say, what is it that I can give that would benefit these people that I'm good at? And all these people are good in innovation. So they all want to come up with this, a new app on the phone or something. They want to innovate something, maybe a drone, whatever.
True.
But they think that if they just solve the problem, it's going to solve the problem. But it won't, right? Because
it has to be bottom up.
Bottom up. But also it has become relevant to them. Because first, you want to create enough capacity in the community for them to be able to want to embrace these things. And so in some ways, it's sad because what happens is, even in US, for example, it's $400 billion a year economy, philanthropy, just philanthropy alone. And a lot of the money goes towards, like let's say a prof at Harvard or MIT can go to a foundation and say, hey, give me $25 million and I'll solve hunger. Any foundation will be very happy to give him 25 million. And they're very sincere. I mean, these profs are very sincere. They'll have 5 graduate students who are also very sincere. They'll work very hard. But they also have pressure to come up with something that's a little bit more complex than what the previous guy did. Otherwise, they can't get a publication, right?
Right.
And so what happens is, even though they're very genuine, everything else, intentions are very good, it becomes an idea factory. And then for the people that you're trying to help, they don't even have capacity to absorb the simplest of these ideas. That's something that originated 25 years ago, right? And so that's a wasted resource. So one of the things that I would love to, part of the reason why I talk about this is I would love to see how that whole research enterprise gets more motivated by impact rather than the complexity of the idea,
how cool the problem is.
How cool the solution is, right? There's a parallel to this with engineering. Engineering research used to be the same way. But over the last 20 years or so, engineering research translational research has changed quite a bit. It has led to a lot of startups, a lot of impact and everything else. So engineering professors now get credit for creating impact, not just for writing papers and everything else. So the social scientists who work on, or think tanks and so on, who work on these problems, I think somehow we need to find a way for them to get credit for the impact that they generate. And so I hope we find a good way to connect the two worlds. On one side you have social workers. Social workers are probably the most connected people. They go to a village and say, let me pick the hardest problem and solve it. And they'll solve it, but maybe they'll solve 4, 5, 6 cases in their lifetime, right? Which is good, but they will not scale. And then on the other side, you have these people who can write brilliant white papers, books and everything else, but nothing happens. So is there a way you can combine the two sides? And that's what we are trying to do in the Deshpande Foundation here.
So wherever there is a college, medical college, there is a hospital also. So that way they've integrated certain things. The professor teaches in the morning and then looks for patients in the afternoon, right? Or in the evening. Do you think an academic model where incentives are aligned to this kind of research?
Yeah, it can work. But what happens is, there's a fundamental problem. Usually the research universities, they're all smart people, very smart people. And whenever you get smart people together, slowly it becomes like a club because they interact with each other, right? And like you say, they don't connect with the patients. And it becomes clubby and moves further and further away from the real world. And so any effort that we can do to connect them back to the impact that they would want to create, I think would fix the problem. And the other thing is, it's a little bit easier in translational engineering projects because most of the time, people who come up with solutions are coming up with solutions for people like themselves. So it's people who have disposable income. They're trying to come up with solutions for other people who have disposable income. It's easier to understand the problem. Right. But smart people who have disposable income, usually, they're smart, they have resources, but they are trying to understand the people whom you're trying to help at the bottom. It's very hard because
there's some disconnect.
Because you don't understand your customers. And their risk tolerances are very different, right?
True.
And so you always design a product that's like over-designed. Risk is, because these guys, poor guys, they live a life that's so hard. That's hard. So we are doing both. We're doing a program in US, it's 80% have disposable, 20% don't have disposable. India is 20-80, right? So in US, we have a program where we create entrepreneurship for those people, bottom 20%. It's called E for All, Entrepreneurship for All. And we have 1,800 companies. 85% of them owned by women. 30% of them were previously unemployed. We're trying to scale it up to 50,000 companies. And so that becomes a category by itself. So I think you can do things. You can come up with interventions, but it's fun. It's fun.
Let's say a genie comes to you at this point and he asks you any 3 wishes. So the intent for this question is to know what are your deepest inherent desires at this point in time. What you really, really want.
A good health.
Okay.
Ability to continue to connect with people around me. And ability to innovate.
Can you specify a couple of problems in your life or in the business? Can you specify them so that anybody who's watching that, if we find that problem aligned to his or her interest or motivation, he can approach any problem in life or business?
I think you go through problems and difficult situations. For example, even Tejas, we went public. And then the 3G scam happened. Suddenly our revenue went down from 500 crores to maybe half of it. So we were running out of cash. And then suddenly the company caught fire.
Yes, sir told me. Sir. Yeah.
So it looked totally hopeless. But I think a good entrepreneur always is a irrationally optimistic. And that irrational optimism helps. So somehow people who are pessimists don't make good entrepreneurs. So somehow you have to continue to develop that. It's irrational, but somehow you believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today.
Right.
And it's not a disadvantage. That naivete is what helps you. And so you somehow, sometimes you just hang it there and you find solution and the problems go away and you continue. So I think the lesson there is that being irrationally optimistic is not a bad thing.
Got it. But what's the problem in your life or business?
If it's business, you run out of cash. You can't do a payroll. This happened just 5 months ago. We run this large foundation. Suddenly we got a letter saying your FCRA is not renewed and your banks are frozen. So how do you do the payroll, right? And so fortunately, there were well-wishing people who loaned us some money. And then over the course of next 5-6 months or so, we got the FCRA approved and everything else, but it was existential, right? So these things happen. But when they happen, it sounds like that's the end of the world.
Right.
But if you have a calm demeanor, and if you hang in there, you'll find a solution.
This is extremely mix of philosophy, stories, and business. As I'm liking that. So you have flown in the Air Force once, Air Force One once, with Bill Clinton. Tell me about that experience. How was it?
Well, I think it's Akshay Patra, and they used to have a thing called Clinton Global Initiative. So Clinton, after he stepped down as a president, he became the ambassador for Haiti, not a philanthropic ambassador.
Right.
And he used to run a program for midday meals. And he used to serve 1,000 meals a day. And he was very proud of it. But the person who used to run that program had come here to our conference, and he saw the Akshay Patra in Hubli. It's 250,000 meals a day. And so he went and told Clinton that I'm involved with this program and I should come to Haiti. So they kept calling me, and I usually don't respond that well to, I don't want to mix with them too much. But then after the fifth call, I returned the call, and they said, hey, we want you tomorrow at 9:30 in New York. And they gave me an address. I show up there and there's Air Force One waiting. And actually Bill Clinton, because he's an ex-president, he cannot borrow. He cannot get the Air Force One.
Okay.
Only the current president can get Air Force One. But Ban Ki-moon, who was the head of UN, he can borrow it from the president. So he had borrowed the Air Force One.
Okay.
So Ban Ki-moon, there's a Paul Farmer, who's another philanthropist, and then Bill Clinton and another person, John Wycliffe. So we all went there. It was 36 hours.
Uh-huh.
And of course, you go land there, there's like people everywhere, all lined up. And so we came back, and it's all Air Force is all the air hostesses and the pilots, they're all Air Force people. So when we came back, we landed in St. Andrews Air Force. And so the immigration officer and everybody else, they come inside the thing and they saluted, welcome, sir. So it's a royal treatment. But then later on, actually, he wanted to see a kitchen, a Akshay kitchen. So in 2014, I think, I came with him and we traveled together for a week. We came to Jaipur and then Lucknow and then Hanoi, Papua New Guinea, Borneo, all that stuff. So I spent a little bit of time with Bill Clinton and these guys, they have a very broad perspective. They know a lot of things. And so it was nice.
Do you have any insight into the future, sir? Are you sure about something happening 50 years down the line? If you were to predict certain things, what those things could be? And you please take your time in this.
Well, I'm sort of a big believer that problems will come along, but the ingenuity of the people will find solutions to those. Right now it sort of looks like, hey, we'll be able to feed all the people, we'll be able to deal with climate change, we'll be able to deal with energy, all these things. But when problems become intense, I think we have a way, the world seems to have a way to come together and find a way out of it.
Right.
But unfortunately, in the process of finding the solution, there'll be people who get displaced, people who get into trouble. And the smartest of the smart will have a fantastic time because they're always on top of the game. But the people who are left behind, it will have a harder time. And so I'm hoping that people will see that as a problem, and then there'll be more and more foundations like what we're doing here to make sure that we build an infrastructure for them, a trapeze for them, so that there's a safety net for them to play within that new evolving game that happens. So,
what is one thing, sir, that you're teaching your grandchildren right now? And what is one thing that you often find yourself telling your children?
Well, the world is going to change pretty fast. It's changed quite a bit. It's going to continue to change. And so always embrace the change. Don't fight the change. Because we only have two options. Either you grudgingly accept the change and then you drag yourself, or you willingly accept the change and lead it in the right direction to whatever extent that you can so that the world is heading the right way. But to be able to lead the change, you have to create some excitement within you for innovation, learning new things and everything else. So constantly you're learning.
Is there a change that you are embracing right now? which you find very hard?
Well, I mean, everything, right? I mean, they all this mobile stuff, and every time I come to India, it's like, I mean, I don't carry cash anymore. You just do this. It doesn't matter where you go. You can just do these Google Pays and all that kind of stuff. So things change, and it's pretty dramatic, and just being able to do those things is important. If you move further and further away from them, you get afraid of those things, and so you cannot be afraid of it.
Last two questions, sir. Because you were advising Obama, sir, also. Give us some interesting stories there, and what were certain lessons that you learned from him?
Well, I mean, I think it's not so much him; it's more the job itself.
Okay.
So that was a new experience for me because I'm not a policy guy, or I don't work in Washington or Delhi that much. So when you are in those jobs and you're looking at the whole country, the magnitude of the problem you're looking at is very different. And you have to think about in a policy level as a big thing. And but you can have a lot of impact if you can actually bring about a change. So we figured out why entrepreneurship was important and why it should be celebrated. So we came up with a very simple way of celebrating entrepreneurship in the White House, so that entrepreneurs feel like it's a much needed thing. And then, to support that ecosystem, you need good ideas, which is what this NSF, ICORP, all the stuff that we worked on. And then you need access to money.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked on a thing called Jobs Act, which, there was a thing called Sarbanes-Oxley at that time because there was a lot of misuse in the public markets.
Right.
They had really overburdened all the companies with all these regulations and everything else. And it was impossible for small companies to go public or raise money or anything like that. So we got a lot of relief from that Sarbanes-Oxley thing for companies less than $1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And then also allowed people to raise money through crowdfunding and all that kind of stuff, because otherwise crowdfunding was not possible. Only qualified investors could put money, right? So that was a good thing. And then access to markets. So, government is the biggest procurement. So they making some room available for these small companies
Mm-hmm.
to take advantage of that procurement was another one. And then, of course, mentoring, create a national mentoring network and so on. So it was nice to be able to work at a level where you're thinking about the ecosystem. I think either you're an entrepreneur or you're creating an ecosystem, right? And that was my first job where I was thinking more about the ecosystem, which really helped me a lot, because then I created a thing called Mass Challenge in Boston and all this stuff.
Right.
We have a big incubation center here that you'll see tomorrow. But all of these are not being the entrepreneur, but creating a system that nurtures other entrepreneurs to do things.
Last thing, sir. So we are trying very hard, although the chances are bleak right now. But I'm very hopeful that we will interview Narayana sir one day. If you were to interview him, because, I was reading that you call, although he's your brother-in-law, you also call him your guru. Tell us, what are certain things that you have learned from him? If you can pin out one very interesting story, and if you were to interview him, what is one thing that you would ask, sir?
Well, I mean, his ability to think big, right? I mean, setting up Infosys here in India is not a simple task. And given all the hassles that he went through, like waiting for 2 years to get a telephone line,
Yes,
getting approval to travel anywhere, all that stuff. It's like when you have so many hurdles along the way, it's very easy to give up or diminish what it is that you're trying to do. But he didn't. And that's a big lesson.
And what's the best advice that you have received from Narayana sir?
Ability not to compromise,
Mm-hmm.
not to compromise your values, and keep doing the right things.
My dear sir, I have so much to learn, but I'll respect your time, and I'm genuinely grateful